The hallway stretched out before me like the gullet of some great, devouring beast, the patterned carpet blurring into a nauseating streak of burgundy and gold as I forced my burning legs to carry me faster than I had ever moved in my life. The sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out the soft hum of the hotel's ventilation system. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to curl into a ball and accept the inevitable, to surrender to the darkness that had been nipping at my heels since I stole the flash drive from the senator's safe. But the primal urge to survive was a stubborn, screeching thing that refused to let me stop even as my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass and fire. I could hear them behind me, the heavy, rhythmic thud of military-grade boots hitting the floorboards, a sound that signaled not just capture, but a slow and agonizing execution that would likely end with my body being dissolved in a barrel of acid somewhere in the industrial district. My fingers, slick with cold sweat, and trembling so violently I could barely function, clutched the stolen plastic keycard I had swiped from the housekeeping cart 3 floors down, praying to whatever deity listened to desperate thieves that the magnetic strip would actually work on room 1204. I didn't have a plan beyond this moment, didn't have an exit strategy or a getaway car waiting in the alley, because all of my meticulous planning had disintegrated the second the alarms tripped, leaving me with nothing but adrenaline and this singular, desperate hope that an empty hotel room might offer me a few minutes of sanctuary to figure out how to vanish. I reached the door, my heart hammering against my ribs with such violence that I thought it might crack the bone, and I jammed the card into the slot, holding my breath as the little light blinked red once, an eternity of terrifying failure, before flashing a miraculous green that sounded like the click of salvation. I threw my weight against the heavy mahogany, nearly sobbing with a mixture of hysteria and relief when the mechanism disengaged with a hydraulic hiss, allowing me to stumble into the dim sanctuary of the suite, just as the elevator chime echoed down the corridor like a funeral bell, signaling the arrival of more men who wanted me dead. I slammed the door shut and twisted the deadbolt with frantic fingers, collapsing back against the wood as my legs finally gave out, sliding down until my tailbone hit the floor, and I pressed my hands over my mouth to stifle the whimper that was clawing its way up my throat. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears, a deafening roar that masked the reality of where I was, allowing me to exist in a suspended state of terror, where the only thing that mattered was the 3 inches of wood separating me from the monsters in the hallway. But as my breathing slowed from a panic-stricken gasp to a trembling rhythm, the sensory details of the room began to bleed through the haze of my fear, and I realized with a sudden, sinking dread that the air didn't smell like sterile cleaning products or the generic lemon polish of a vacant hotel suite. Instead, the atmosphere was thick and heavy, saturated with the rich, dark scents of expensive sandalwood, the sharp bite of gunpowder, and the distinct, metallic tang of unbridled masculinity, a combination that triggered a new, more primal alarm bell deep within my subconscious. I opened my eyes, which I hadn't realized I'd squeezed shut, and scrambled to my feet, my back still pressed flat against the door as I turned my gaze toward the center of the room, expecting perhaps a startled businessman or a confused tourist who would reach for the phone to call security. What I saw paralyzed me more effectively than any weapon could have, freezing the scream in my throat and turning my blood to ice as I stared at the man standing before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a towering wall of sculpted muscle and violence who seemed to suck all the light out of the room. He was facing away from me, but the reflection in the glass offered a terrifyingly clear view of a face carved from granite and cruelty, with high cheekbones that could cut glass, and eyes so dark they looked like abysses where light went to die. He was shirtless, his broad back a tapestry of jagged white scars and intricate black ink that seemed to writhe over his deltoids like living shadows. A visual history of violence that told me instantly that I had not stumbled into the room of a civilian, but into the lair of a predator, far more dangerous than the dogs chasing me. He didn't jump, didn't flinch, didn't even pause in what he was doing, which was the slow, deliberate act of fastening a leather holster around his waist, his movements possessing a fluid, lethal grace that spoke of a man who was entirely comfortable with weapons and the death they brought. His trousers were unbuttoned at the waist, hanging low on his hips in a way that felt obscenely intimate given the circumstances, exposing the V-lines of muscle that disappeared into the dark fabric. And on the dresser beside him lay a matte black semi-automatic pistol, gleaming under the warm glow of the lamp, like a coiled snake waiting to strike. I watched, unable to breathe, as he picked up a pair of diamond cufflinks with a calm that was almost psychopathic, sliding them through the cuffs of a white dress shirt that lay waiting on the velvet ottoman, his eyes in the mirror locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity that pinned me to the spot. There was no surprise in that gaze, no confusion or fear, only a cold, calculating annoyance, as if my sudden intrusion was nothing more than a mild inconvenience in his schedule of violence, like a fly buzzing around a lion's head. I'm sorry, I managed to whisper, the words scraping against my raw throat. But before I could explain, before I could beg for mercy or unlock the door, to flee back into the hallway, he moved. The transition from stillness to violence was so fast my eyes could barely track it. One moment he was adjusting his cuffs, and the next he was crossing the room with long, predatory strides that ate up the distance between us, the air displacement hitting me a second before he did. He slammed a hand against the door right beside my head, the wood groaning under the impact, and his other hand wrapped around my throat, not squeezing enough to crush my windpipe, but applying enough pressure to let me know that my life was now entirely in his possession. "Quiet," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through my chest, vibrating with a menace that made my knees buckle, forcing me to cling to his forearm just to stay upright. I stared up at him, my eyes wide and watering, realizing with a jolt of recognition that I knew this face, not from the society pages, but from the hushed whispers of the terrified criminals I had grown up around, stories told in the dark about a man who was less of a mob boss and more of a ghost, a wraith who ruled the city's underworld with a brutality that made the devil blush. Calum Vesper, the Don of the Vesper crime family, the man who was rumored to have cut out a rival's tongue at a charity gala without getting a drop of blood on his tuxedo, was currently standing half-naked in front of me, holding my life in his scarred hand while I trespassed in his sanctuary. "Please," I mouthed, unable to vocalize the plea as the sound of heavy boots skidded to a halt directly outside the door, the muffled voices of the men chasing me drifting through the wood like the whispers of demons. Calum's eyes, which had been boring into mine with murderous intent, flickered toward the door as he heard the voices, and I saw a shift in his expression, a subtle tightening of his jaw and a narrowing of his gaze that told me he recognized the men outside. The realization hit us both at the same time. The men hunting me were soldiers for the Russo cartel, the sworn enemies of the Vesper family, and by bringing them to his door, I had inadvertently threatened the secrecy of his safe house and brought a war to his doorstep. I stopped breathing, my heart thudding so loudly I was certain the men in the hallway could hear it, certain that they would kick down the door any second and find me pinned against the wall by their boss's greatest rival, a tableau that would result in a bloodbath that would leave no survivors. Calum didn't move, his body pressing me harder against the door, his heat radiating through my thin blouse, encompassing me in a cloud of his expensive cologne and his own dangerous scent, effectively shielding me with his massive frame while he listened to the conversation outside. "She went this way. I swear I heard a door," a gruff voice growled, the handle of the door rattling violently as someone tried to force it open, causing me to flinch and squeeze my eyes shut, a tear leaking out to trace a hot path down my cheek. "It's locked, you idiot, and these are reinforced suites," another voice hissed, the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, the tension in the hallway thick enough to choke on. "If we kick it in and it's a civilian, the cops will be here in 3 minutes, and the boss said stealth, not a massacre." Calum's grip on my throat tightened imperceptibly, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse point on my neck, and when I opened my eyes, I found him watching me with a dark, unreadable expression, as if he were weighing the pros and cons of handing me over to them right now to save himself the trouble. I stared back, pleading silently with everything I had, trying to convey that I had nowhere else to go, that opening that door was a death sentence, and that despite the fact that he was a monster, he was currently the lesser of two evils. The men outside argued for another agonizing minute, their voices rising and falling, before the sound of a radio crackled and the leader barked an order to check the stairwell. Their heavy footsteps finally retreating down the hall, fading into the distance until silence reclaimed the corridor. I let out a shuddering breath, my legs turning to jelly. But Calum didn't step back. Instead, he leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, so close I could see the flecks of silver in his obsidian eyes and count the individual lashes that framed them. He didn't look relieved that the danger had passed. He looked furious, a cold, simmering rage that was far more terrifying than the shouting men outside, because it was controlled, focused, and directed entirely at me. "You have brought Rousseau's dogs to my door," he whispered, the words soft but laced with lethal intent, his hand sliding from my throat to grip my jaw, tilting my head back so I was forced to look directly into the abyss of his gaze. "Do you have any idea what I do to people who compromise my security, little mouse?" "I didn't know," I gasped, my voice trembling, my hand still clutching his forearm as if he were an anchor in a storm. "I just needed a place to hide. I didn't know it was you." "Ignorance is not a defense I accept," he replied smoothly, his thumb brushing over my lower lip with a roughness that sent a shockwave of electricity straight to my core, confusing my fear with a sudden, unwanted spike of arousal that I shoved down immediately. "You broke into my room, you interrupted my evening, and you brought my enemies within 10 feet of where I sleep." He finally released my jaw and stepped back, but the space he put between us didn't make me feel safer. It just allowed me to see the full extent of his dangerous physique again, the way the muscles in his chest shifted as he reached for the white dress shirt he had abandoned. He pulled it on slowly, not bothering to button it immediately, letting the fabric hang open to reveal the dark ink on his torso, watching me the entire time like a cat watching a bird with a broken wing. "I can leave," I stammered, turning toward the door and reaching for the deadbolt, desperate to escape the suffocating intensity of his presence, even if it meant taking my chances in the stairwell. "I'll go. I won't tell anyone I saw you. Touch that lock, and I will put a bullet in your kneecap before you can turn the handle," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact that froze my hand in midair. I turned back to him slowly, my heart sinking into my stomach as I saw that he had picked up the gun from the dresser and was now idly checking the safety, his eyes never leaving my face. "You think you can just walk out of here?" he asked, a dark, humorless smile touching his lips, transforming his face from statuesque beauty to something demonic. "You overheard them. You know who was chasing you, and now you know who is hiding here. You are a loose end, Alara Vance." My blood ran cold at the sound of my name. I hadn't told him who I was, hadn't shown him an ID, which meant he knew exactly who I was, likely from the bounty that the senator had put on my head the moment I vanished with the drive. "How do you know my name?" I whispered, backing away until my shoulders hit the door again, trapping me. "I know everything that happens in this city," he said, walking toward me again, this time stopping only when the tips of his polished shoes touched the tips of my battered sneakers. "I know you stole something very valuable from Senator Corcoran, and I know that the Rousseaus have been hired to retrieve it and bury you in the Pine Barrens." He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair and pulling my head back until my neck was exposed to him, a gesture of dominance that made my breath hitch. "The Rousseaus want you dead," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were brushing the sensitive skin below my ear, sending shivers cascading down my spine. "But I am a businessman, Alara. I see potential where others see problems. What do you want? I asked, my voice barely audible, terrified of the answer. I want what you stole, he said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating against my skin. And until I get it, you belong to me. He pulled back to look me in the eyes, and in that moment, I saw my fate sealed in the darkness of his gaze. I had escaped the wolves only to run straight into the jaws of the dragon, and looking at the predatory hunger in Calum Vesper's eyes, I realized that getting killed by the Russos might have been the merciful option. Start talking, he commanded, releasing my hair and stepping back to button his shirt with agonizing slowness, covering the scars but not the danger. And make it convincing, because my patience is thinner than the dress you're almost wearing, and I have a very busy night ahead of me. The silence that stretched between us following his demand was heavier than the mahogany door, pressing into my spine. A suffocating, tangible weight that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room, leaving me lightheaded and trembling under the scrutiny of a man who looked at me not as a human being, but as a puzzle he was deciding whether to solve or simply smash against the wall. My hands were still raised in a gesture of surrender that felt pathetic against the sheer, overwhelming lethality radiating from Calum Vesper, his chest rising and falling with a slow, hypnotic rhythm that was terrifyingly calm compared to the frantic, hummingbird beat of my own heart, threatening to bruise my ribs. I knew that I had seconds, perhaps less, to give him a reason to keep me breathing, to offer him something more valuable than the silence he commanded, because the darkness in his eyes promised that violence was not a last resort for him, but a primary language he spoke with devastating fluency. I'm a cleaner, I blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush as I tried to force my paralyzed tongue to cooperate, my gaze darting to the gun resting so casually in his hand, before snapping back to his face. I worked for Senator Corcoran's private estate, the one in the hills, handling the night shifts because they wanted staff who were invisible, people who would scrub the floors and polish the silver without ever looking the guests in the eye. Calum didn't speak, didn't offer a nod of encouragement, or a flicker of interest. He simply stood there like a statue carved from judgment, his fingers continuing to button his shirt with agonizing precision, effectively silently commanding me to continue while he covered the tattoos that marked him as a criminal king. He didn't think I was in the room, I continued, my voice gaining a tremulous strength born of pure adrenaline, desperate to make him understand the gravity of what I carried. They were in the study, Corcoran and a man from the Russo organization, discussing shipments, trafficking routes, names of judges they had bought and paid for, and they were laughing about how easy it was to bleed the city dry while the public cheered for them. I paused to swallow the lump of terror in my throat, watching Calum's hands finally stop moving, his fingers hovering over the last button of his pristine white shirt as his attention sharpened, the mention of the Russos and the senator acting as the key that turned the lock of his interest. I was in the adjoining bathroom, cleaning the marble, and the door was cracked just enough for me to see them open the wall safe, I whispered, the memory of that moment washing over me with a fresh wave of nausea. I saw the combination, and when they left to go down to the wine cellar to celebrate their deal, I don't know why I did it. I don't know what possessed me. But I opened the safe and took the flash drive they had been bragging about, the one they said was their insurance policy. Calum moved then, stepping into my personal space with a fluidity that made me gasp and press myself harder against the wood, the scent of him, sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and the metallic tang of gun oil, invading my senses and making my head spin. He didn't touch me, but he leaned down until our faces were level, his dark eyes searching mine with a terrifying intensity, looking for the telltale flicker of a lie, probing the depths of my fear to see if my story held the weight of truth. You stole the senator's insurance policy, he repeated, his voice a low, skeptical rumble that vibrated through my chest. And you expect me to believe that a cleaning girl managed to walk out of a secure compound with the most dangerous digital footprint in the city without being stopped? I knew the service exits, I insisted, pleading with him to believe me, because if he didn't, he would throw me out into the hallway and I would be dead before I reached the elevator. I knew where the cameras had blind spots because I'm the one who has to clean the lenses. And I ran, Calum. I ran until my feet bled, and I've been running for 2 days because I know that if they catch me, they won't just kill me, they'll make it last for weeks. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his gaze dropping from my eyes to the heaving rise and fall of my chest, then lower, scanning my disheveled appearance, the torn hem of my cheap uniform skirt, the dirt smudged on my arms, and finally resting on the frantic pulse visible in my neck. "Where is it?" he asked simply, extending a hand that was large, scarred, and undeniably capable of breaking me in half without effort. I hesitated, a flush of heat creeping up my neck that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the location of the drive. But I knew I had no leverage, no right to modesty in front of a man who was debating whether or not to end my life. With shaking hands, I reached into the neckline of my blouse, my fingers brushing against the cold, hard plastic tucked securely inside the cup of my bra, and I pulled out the small silver flash drive that had cost me my life as I knew it. I placed it in his open palm, flinching slightly as his fingers brushed against mine, his skin rough and calloused in contrast to the smooth metal of the drive. He didn't look at it immediately. He kept his eyes on me, holding my gaze captive as his fingers closed over the device, claiming it, and by extension, claiming the problem that came with it. "You realize?" he said softly, slipping the drive into the pocket of his trousers with a casual arrogance that suggested he handled explosive secrets every day. "That by giving me this, you haven't bought your freedom, but merely traded one captor for another." "I'd rather be a prisoner than a corpse," I whispered, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. But the relief of no longer holding the physical burden of the drive was dizzying. He turned away from me then, dismissing my presence as if I were a piece of furniture, and walked back to the mirror to finish dressing, an act that felt strangely intimate and incredibly domineering as he ignored the woman trembling by his door. I watched, mesmerized despite my terror, as he shrugged into a shoulder holster, the leather creaking softly as he adjusted the straps over his white shirt, the weapon sitting snug against his ribs, a permanent extension of his body. He picked up his suit jacket from the bed, a charcoal gray masterpiece of Italian tailoring that likely cost more than I made in a year, and slipped it on, smoothing the lapels with deliberate, graceful movements that concealed the violence strapped to his chest, transforming him from a raw, scarred warrior into a civilized monster in a silk tie. He reached for his phone, swiping the screen with a thumb, and pressed it to his ear, his back to me as he spoke in a language I didn't recognize. Italian, perhaps, or something older and darker. His voice clipped, authoritative, barking commands that I couldn't understand, but the tone of which sent shivers down my spine. I stood there, trapped in the limbo of his hotel room, listening to the muffled sounds of the city outside the window, realizing that the world was going on as usual, while my life was being completely rewritten by the man standing in front of the mirror. He ended the call and turned back to me, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold indifference that was somehow more frightening than anger. "The elevator is compromised," he stated flatly, walking toward me and grabbing his coat from the chair, draping it over his arm. "My men are clearing the lobby, but getting from here to the car is going to be complicated." Are you going to let me go?" I asked, a foolish hope blooming in my chest even though I knew the answer before he spoke. Calum laughed, a dark, humorless sound that was more of a bark than a chuckle. "Let you go? You just handed me the leverage to topple a senator and cripple the Russo family in a single night, and you think I'm going to open the door and let you wander back out into the street where anyone with a knife could take this information from you?" He stepped closer, looming over me, his presence encompassing my entire field of vision, forcing me to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. "You are a loose end, Alara," he said, the use of my name sounding like a curse on his lips. "And until I verify what is on this drive, and until I decide how best to use it to burn Corcoran's world to the ground, you are not a free woman. You are an asset, and I protect my assets." He reached out and grabbed my wrist, his grip like an iron shackle, warm and unyielding. And before I could protest or pull away, he yanked me away from the door and positioned me at his side, tucking me into the curve of his body so that I was practically hidden beneath his arm. "We are walking out of here," he instructed, his voice low and right next to my ear, sending a tremor through me. "You will keep your head down, you will not make a sound, and you will move when I move. If you trip, I will drag you, and if you scream, I will silence you myself." He unlocked the door with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, and then he pulled it open, dragging me out into the hallway, where the air was still thick with the lingering tension of the men who had been hunting me. The corridor was empty now, stretching out in long, silent lines of perspective, but the threat felt palpable, hiding in the shadows of the alcoves and behind the closed doors of the other suites. Calum didn't hesitate. He moved with a purposeful stride, his body shielding mine, his gun hand free and hovering near his jacket, ready to draw at the slightest provocation. Being this close to him was a confusing assault on my senses. I hated him. I feared him. I knew he was a criminal who had likely killed more people than I had ever met. And yet, walking in his shadow, surrounded by his scent and the solid wall of his body, I felt a twisted, paradoxical sense of safety that I hadn't felt in 48 hours. We bypassed the main elevators, Calum guiding us toward the service stairwell at the end of the hall, his grip on my wrist never loosening, a constant reminder that I was being led, not saved. He kicked the stairwell door open, sweeping the landing with a sharp gaze before pulling me into the concrete echo chamber. The sound of our footsteps magnified as we began the descent, moving fast, skipping steps, descending into the belly of the beast. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, struggling to keep up with his long legs, my breath coming in short bursts as we spiraled down flight after flight. "You could have just taken the drive and left me there." "And let the Russos find you 5 minutes later?" he replied without looking back, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "They would torture you until you told them who you gave it to, and then I would lose the element of surprise. You are collateral damage, Alara, necessary baggage to ensure my victory." We burst out of the stairwell into the underground parking garage, the sudden change in light blinding me for a second, the smell of exhaust and cold concrete filling my nose. A sleek, black, armored SUV was idling near the exit, its windows tinted so dark they looked like oil slicks, and 2 massive men in suits were standing by the open rear door, their hands clasped in front of them, looking like gargoyles guarding a tomb. Calum didn't stop to introduce me. He practically threw me into the back seat, the leather cool and smelling of new car and old money, and climbed in right behind me, the heavy door slamming shut with a thud that sealed us inside a soundproof bubble. The lock engaged with a definitive click, and the driver peeled out of the garage before I had even managed to sit up straight, the acceleration pressing me back into the seat. I scrambled to the far side of the car, pressing myself against the door, trying to put as much distance between us as the confined space allowed, watching warily as Calum settled back, adjusting his cuffs, looking as composed as if he were leaving a board meeting rather than fleeing a potential shootout. He looked over at me, his eyes gleaming in the passing streetlights that strobed through the tinted glass, illuminating the sharp angles of his face and the cruel set of his mouth. "You're shaking," he observed, not with concern but with clinical detachment. "I'm terrified," I snapped, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion and anger. "You kidnapped me." "I extracted you," he corrected, reaching into a hidden compartment in the armrest and pulling out a crystal tumbler and a bottle of amber liquid. "There is a difference." He poured a drink, the liquid sloshing gently as the car took a sharp turn, heading away from the city center and toward the darker, wealthier districts, where the skyline was jagged with penthouses and power. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice small, watching the city blur past, realizing that with every mile, my old life was disappearing further into the rearview mirror. "To the only place the Russos cannot reach?" He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine over the rim of the glass. "My home." The word home sounded alien coming from him, suggesting warmth and comfort, two things I doubted Calum Vesper was capable of providing. I looked at the lock on the door, then back at him, realizing that I had traded the chaos of the run for the calculated control of a dictator. "And then what?" I asked, hugging my arms around myself to ward off the chill of the air conditioning. "Once you see the drive is real, do you let me go?" Calum lowered the glass, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He leaned forward, closing the distance between us, until I could smell the whiskey on his breath, his hand reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering on my neck, resting directly over my pulse. "You have seen my face. You know my safe house, and you carry the secrets of my enemies in your head," he whispered, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin of my throat. "There is no letting you go, Alara. Once you step into my world, the door locks from the outside." I stared at him, my heart pounding against his fingertips, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. "Don't mistake my protection for kindness," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur that was both a promise and a threat, sending a shiver of dread and dark anticipation straight through my veins. "You belong to the Vesper family now, and we keep what is ours. Forever." The elevator ride up to the pinnacle of the Vesper Tower was a silent, suffocating ascent that felt less like rising toward the heavens and more like being transported to a different dimension entirely, one where the oxygen was thinner and the gravity pressed down on my shoulders with the crushing weight of my predicament. Calum stood beside me, not touching me now but radiating a heat and a presence that filled the small mirrored box, his reflection in the polished steel doors staring back at me with a detached, predatory calm that made my skin crawl with a mixture of terror and a dark, confusing fascination. We rose past the 40th floor, the 50th, the numbers on the digital display blurring together as my ears popped, signaling just how far removed I was becoming from the world I knew, from the gritty streets and the service entrances where I had spent my life trying to be invisible. When the doors finally slid open with a soft, hydraulic hiss, they revealed a sprawling penthouse that was less a home and more a fortress of solitude and power. A cavernous expanse of black marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, and sharp modernist furniture that looked as uncomfortable as it was expensive. Calum stepped out first, his footsteps echoing sharply in the vast, empty space, and I hesitated on the threshold, feeling like a vampire invited into a sanctuary, knowing that once I crossed this line, the rules of reality would bend to his will. He didn't turn around to see if I was following, his arrogance assuming my compliance, and so I trailed after him, hugging my arms around my chest as the chill of the air conditioning bit into my skin, my eyes darting around the room to take in the stark, gothic opulence of his world. The view was staggering, a panoramic sweep of the city skyline that lay prostrate beneath us, a grid of glittering lights and crawling traffic that looked insignificant from this height, reinforcing the idea that the man who lived here viewed the rest of humanity as ants to be crushed or ignored. "This is not a hotel, Ilara, so do not expect room service or a mint on your pillow," he said, his voice cutting through the silence without him even turning to face me, as he walked toward a liquor cabinet that looked like an altar to alcoholism. "You will stay in the guest wing, you will not touch the staff, you will not approach the external doors, and if you attempt to use the phone, I will know before you even dial the second digit." He gestured vaguely toward a hallway that vanished into the shadows, dismissing me with the same casual indifference one might show a stray dog they had decided to shelter for the night. I walked in the direction he pointed, my legs heavy with exhaustion, passing pieces of art that were disturbing in their violence, abstract splashes of red and black that looked too much like crime scenes, until I found a heavy oak door that seemed to be the only option. I pushed it open and stepped into a room that was larger than my entire apartment, furnished with a king-sized bed draped in charcoal silk, a sitting area with velvet armchairs, and a wall of glass that offered the same dizzying view of the abyss below. I heard the door click shut behind me, and the sound of the lock turning from the outside was a physical blow to my chest. A final confirmation that despite the silk sheets and the high thread count luxury, I was a prisoner in a gilded cage. I ran to the door, twisting the handle in a futile attempt to open it, shaking the wood with a desperate, silent scream building in my throat, before collapsing against the frame, sliding down until I hit the cold floor. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence of the high-rise, my mind racing through scenarios of torture and death, wondering if the senator's men were already tracking the car, or if Calum Vesper was merely fattening me up before he disposed of me quietly to avoid a war. Eventually, the walls began to close in on me, the stillness of the room becoming unbearable, and I stood up, driven by a restless energy that refused to let me sit and wait for my execution. I moved toward the glass wall, noticing a heavy latch on one of the panels, and with a grunt of effort, I managed to slide the door open, stepping out onto a narrow, wraparound balcony that was buffeted by the high-altitude winds. The air up here was cold and thin, smelling of ozone and distant exhaust, and I walked to the railing, gripping the cold metal until my knuckles turned white, looking down at the vertiginous drop that separated me from freedom. I was contemplating the sheer impossibility of escape, the lack of fire escapes, the sheer glass face of the building, the terrifying drop, when the scent of rich, cherry-wood cigar smoke drifted toward me on the wind, curling around my senses before I even registered that I wasn't alone. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, to see Calum standing in the shadows of the adjacent balcony section, leaning against the wall with one foot propped up behind him, a tumbler of whiskey in one hand and a cigar in the other, the embers glowing like a demon's eye in the darkness. He had removed his jacket and tie, his white shirt unbuttoned at the top to reveal the hollow of his throat, and the wind was whipping his dark hair across his forehead, making him look wild and untamed, a creature of the storm rather than a man of business. "It's a 300-foot drop," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind, low and devoid of mockery, stating the fact with a brutal honesty that chilled me more than the air. "Even if you survived the fall, which you wouldn't, you'd be nothing more than a wet stain on the pavement before you could take a single breath of freedom." "I wasn't going to jump," I replied, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the vastness of the night, hugging my arms tighter around myself to ward off the cold in his intense gaze. "I just needed air. I needed to feel like I wasn't in a coffin." He pushed himself off the wall and walked toward me, moving with that prowling, predatory grace that made every instinct in my body scream danger, stopping only when he was close enough that the heat of his body acted as a barrier against the wind. He took a drag of his cigar, the smoke swirling between us as he exhaled, his eyes traveling over my face, lingering on my lips, my throat, the pulse fluttering wildly beneath my skin, dissecting me with a gaze that felt like a physical touch. "A coffin is quiet," he murmured, stepping into my personal space until my back was pressed against the railing, trapping me between the abyss and the monster. "A coffin is peaceful. What you are in, Ilara, is the eye of a hurricane, and you have no idea how quickly the winds are going to tear you apart." "I gave you the drive," I argued, trying to summon a shred of defiance, tilting my chin up to meet his eyes even though my knees were shaking. "I gave you what you wanted, so why are you keeping me here like a prisoner?" He laughed then, a low, dark sound that rumbled through his chest, and he reached out with his free hand, his fingers grazing my jawline, tracing the bone with a touch that was shockingly gentle yet possessive, sending a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. "You gave me a piece of plastic," he corrected, his thumb brushing over my bottom lip, dragging it down slightly, exposing me. "I tried to access the files while you were pacing in your room, and imagine my lack of surprise when I found that the drive is encrypted with a military-grade rolling cipher that my best tech specialist says will take weeks to crack by brute force." My breath hitched as I realized the corner I had backed myself into. I had hoped the drive would be my ticket out, but instead it had become the chain binding me to him. I don't know the password," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. But I knew that the moment I gave him the code, my value would drop to 0, and a man like Calum Vesper didn't keep useless things around. His eyes narrowed, the amusement vanishing instantly to be replaced by a cold, hard scrutiny that felt like he was peeling back the layers of my mind. He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, the smell of whiskey and smoke overwhelming me. His presence so intense it felt like he was sucking the air out of my lungs. "Don't lie to me, little mouse," he whispered, his voice a velvet threat that wrapped around my throat. "You are smart enough to steal from a senator, smart enough to find my safe house, and smart enough to survive the night. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you didn't check the contents of that drive before you stole it." "I need insurance," I whispered back, my voice trembling, but my resolve hardening, because I knew this was the only card I had left to play in a game I was destined to lose. "If I give you the password, you have no reason to keep me alive. The Russos want me dead, and once you have the dirt on Corcoran, I'm just a witness you don't need." Calum stared at me for a long, agonizing silence, the wind whipping my hair across, my face catching in his stubble, binding us together in the dark. I expected anger, expected him to grab me, to shake me, to threaten me with the violence I knew he was capable of. But instead, a flicker of something else passed through his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or a twisted sort of intrigue. "You think you can bargain with me?" he asked softly, moving his hand from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me in place but not hurting me. "You think you can hold that password hostage and force me to play bodyguard?" "I think I don't have a choice," I said, my heart hammering against his chest as he pressed closer, his hips pinning me against the railing. The hardness of his body a stark contrast to the softness of mine. "You are playing a dangerous game, Alara," he murmured, leaning down until his lips were brushing against the shell of my ear, his hot breath sending shivers cascading down my limbs. "I could hurt you. I could drag you down to the basement and peel the code out of your mind layer by layer until you were begging to tell me." "But you won't," I said, a gamble that felt like jumping off the ledge. "Because you're not a butcher, Calum. You're a businessman, and you know that if you break me, you might damage the memory of the code, and then you lose everything." He pulled back to look at me, his eyes gleaming with a dark, dangerous light. And for the first time, I saw the man beneath the monster, a complex, calculating force of nature, who was used to getting everything he wanted. "You are right," he conceded, his voice dropping to a seductive, terrifying purr. "I won't break your body, not yet." He trailed his fingers down the side of my neck, over my collarbone, resting his hand over the frantic beating of my heart, possessive and heavy. "But there are other ways to extract secrets," he continued, his gaze locking onto mine, holding me captive in a web of darkness and heat. "I can get inside your head just as easily as I can break your bones. I can make you so desperate for my approval, so hungry for my touch, that you will whisper that password to me just to hear me say your name." I stared at him, paralyzed by the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the sexual tension exploding between us like a grenade, thick and suffocating. "Don't test me, little mouse," he warned, stepping back finally, releasing me from his physical hold, but leaving his psychological imprint stamped all over my psyche. "You can keep your secret for tonight, but eventually you will give it to me, and you will do it on your knees." He turned and walked back into the penthouse, disappearing into the shadows of the living room, leaving me alone on the balcony with the wind howling around me, his threat lingering in the air like the smoke from his cigar. I stood there, trembling not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that while I might be safe from the Russos in this fortress, I was in imminent danger of being consumed by the man who owned it. I looked out at the city lights, feeling the phantom pressure of his hand on my neck, the ghost of his breath on my skin, and I knew that he was right. Calum Vesper didn't need to torture me to get what he wanted. He was going to dismantle my defenses piece by piece, seducing the secret out of me until I surrendered not just the password but myself. And as I turned to go back into the cage he had built for me, the most terrifying thought of all was that part of me, the dark, broken part that had always been drawn to the fire, was already looking forward to the burn. The hours that followed our confrontation on the balcony bled into a sleepless, agonizing night that stretched into a day filled with a silence so oppressive it felt like the air pressure in the penthouse was slowly crushing my lungs, leaving me to pace the length of the marble floors like a tiger in a zoo, waiting for the keeper to return with either food or a tranquilizer dart. I had spent the entire day watching the news feeds on the massive television screen, my heart leaping into my throat every time a breaking news banner flashed across the bottom, terrified that I would see my own face plastered there as a missing person, or worse, a fugitive wanted for theft. But the screen remained blissfully ignorant of my existence, focusing instead on a sudden, mysterious explosion at a warehouse in the industrial district that authorities were calling a gas leak, but which my gut told me was something far more sinister. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the city in bruised shades of purple and blood orange, and just as the shadows in the corners of the room began to lengthen and reach for me, the elevator doors slid open with a chime that sounded less like a welcome and more like a warning bell tolling in a graveyard. Calum stormed into the room, and the atmosphere instantly shifted from cold sterility to a volatile, electric charge of violence, because the man who walked in was not the composed, arrogant king who had left that morning in a tailored suit, but a gladiator returning from the slaughter, his jacket missing, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms splattered with dark, drying crimson that I prayed wasn't his own. He looked terrifying, a creature of pure rage and adrenaline, his chest heaving with exertion and his eyes wild, searching the room until they locked onto me where I stood frozen by the sofa. And the sheer intensity of his gaze made me want to bolt for the safety of the bedroom, yet my feet remained rooted to the spot, as if his presence exerted a gravitational pull I couldn't resist. He didn't say a word, didn't offer an explanation for the blood or the lateness of the hour, but simply marched past me toward the wet bar, grabbing a bottle of vodka with a hand that was wrapped in a crude, blood-soaked handkerchief, the glass clinking sharply against the counter as he poured a drink with shaking, violent movements. I watched him down the liquid in one swallow, the muscles of his back tense and coiled beneath his shirt, and I realized with a sudden jolt of clarity that the explosion on the news hadn't been an accident, and that whatever war I had started by stealing that drive was no longer a theoretical threat, but a bloody reality that was currently dripping onto his expensive floor. My instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to stay quiet, to make myself small and invisible until his temper cooled, but seeing the dark stains spreading on the makeshift bandage around his hand triggered a different, more foolish impulse, a need to tend to the wounds that were likely inflicted because of the target I had painted on his back. I walked into the kitchen area, retrieving the first aid kit I had found earlier while searching for a weapon, and approached him slowly, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, announcing my presence before I reached him, so I wouldn't startle a man who was clearly still in combat mode. "You're bleeding," I said softly, the words hanging in the tense air between us, and I set the kit down on the counter next to his empty glass, reaching out tentatively to touch his wrist just below the injured hand. He flinched, his head snapping around to look at me with a snarl that died on his lips when he saw the gauze in my hand. his eyes darkening from pure rage to a simmering, complex mix of exhaustion and wariness. He didn't pull away, which I took as permission, and I began to unwrap the sodden handkerchief, peeling the fabric away from his skin with trembling fingers to reveal a nasty, jagged gash across his palm that looked like it had been made by a knife, the wound weeping fresh blood that mixed with the dried gore on his skin. I worked in silence, cleaning the cut with antiseptic that made him hiss through his teeth, the sound intimate and sharp in the quiet room. And as I wrapped his hand in fresh, sterile bandages, I could feel the heat radiating off him, a furnace of pent-up violence and energy that was both terrifying and strangely magnetic. "They hit one of my distribution centers," he said suddenly, his voice rough and gravelly, lacking its usual polished cadence, as if the violence of the day had stripped away his civilized veneer. "The Russos sent a message, a blunt, fiery statement that they know I have you, and that they are willing to burn this city to ash to get the drive back." I looked up from his hand to find him watching me, his gaze dropping to my lips, and then back to my eyes, the air between us thickening with a sudden, suffocating awareness that had nothing to do with the danger outside and everything to do with the man standing inches from me. "I didn't want this," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt." "In this world, Ilara, blood is the currency we trade in," he murmured, lifting his uninjured hand to cut my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone, leaving a smear of someone else's blood on my skin that felt like a brand, marking me as part of his violent life. "And you have just become the most expensive thing I own." The tenderness of his touch was a stark, jarring contrast to the violence in his eyes, and before I could process the duality, the tension that had been building between us since the hotel room snapped like a taut wire, he didn't lean in slowly. He surged forward, his mouth capturing mine with a hunger that was desperate and bruising, a kiss that tasted of vodka, copper, and smoke, possessing me completely and robbing me of the ability to think or breathe. It wasn't a kiss of romance or affection, but a claiming, a chaotic collision of adrenaline and desire where he sought to erase the violence of the day in the softness of my mouth. And God help me, I kissed him back, my hands clutching the lapels of his ruined shirt, drawn into the darkness of him, because it was the only thing that felt real in a world that was falling apart. He groaned low in his throat, backing me up until my hips hit the edge of the counter, his body pressing flush against mine, hard and unyielding, making me feel small and protected and terrified all at once. For a moment, we were just two people seeking oblivion in each other. But then he pulled back just as abruptly as he had started, his chest heaving, his eyes black and blown wide with a realization that hardened his features back into the mask of the dawn. "This," he said breathlessly, gesturing between us, "this changes nothing, and it changes everything." He stepped back, putting distance between us, running a hand through his hair as he regained his composure, the predator locking himself back in the cage of the strategist. "The Russos will not stop," he stated, his voice regaining its cold, commanding edge, leaving no room for argument. "They will come for you with lawyers, with hitmen, with police on their payroll, and as things stand, you are just a civilian, a thief with no standing and no protection under the laws of our world." "So what do we do?" I asked, my lips still tingling from his kiss, dread pooling in my stomach as I saw the calculation in his eyes. "We change your standing," he said, walking toward me again. But this time there was no passion in his stride, only the ruthless determination of a general making a tactical sacrifice. "We bind you to the Vesper family in a way that makes touching you an act of total war that even the Russos cannot afford to commit without signing their own death warrants." He stopped in front of me, looking down with a gaze that stripped me bare, and delivered the sentence that would seal my fate more effectively than any prison cell. "You can leave now and take your chances on the street, where you will be dead before sunrise," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Or you can marry me, Ilara." I stared at him, the room spinning slightly, the absurdity of the proposal clashing with the deadly seriousness of his expression, realizing that he wasn't asking for my hand in love, but demanding my life in exchange for my survival. "If you are my wife," he continued, stepping closer until I was trapped by his presence once more, "you become a Vesper, and under the ancient laws of the families, no one touches the Don's wife without starting a war that will leave no survivors." He reached out, taking my chin in his hand, forcing me to look at the blood still staining his skin, the physical evidence of the violence he was offering to shield me with. "Marry me," he commanded, his eyes burning into mine with a dark promise of ownership that sent a shiver down my spine. "And I will burn the world down before I let them take you." The woman staring back at me from the gilded floor-to-ceiling mirror was a stranger, a spectral vision draped in a gown of liquid midnight silk that clung to every curve of my body like a second skin. The fabric so dark it seemed to absorb the light around me, transforming the terrified girl who had run through a hotel hallway just 48 hours ago into a creature of cold, regal beauty who looked like she belonged in the shadows of Calum Vesper's world. There was no trace of the cleaner in the cheap uniform, no sign of the fugitive trembling in the back of an armored car. Instead, the reflection showed a woman with kohl-rimmed eyes that held the hard, glittering shine of a survivor. Her hair swept up in an intricate twist that exposed the vulnerable curve of her neck. A neck that was now adorned with a diamond choker that felt less like jewelry and more like a collar claiming ownership. I ran my hands down the smooth, cool fabric of the dress, feeling the way the backless cut left my spine exposed to the air, a deliberate design choice by Calum that made me feel simultaneously empowered and incredibly vulnerable, as if he wanted the world to see the beauty he possessed, while reminding me that his hand was the only thing standing between me and the abyss. The heavy door to the dressing room clicked open, and Calum stepped inside. The sight of him in a tuxedo cutting the air from my lungs because he looked devastatingly handsome and utterly lethal. The sharp tailoring of his suit unable to hide the predator that lurked beneath the civilized surface. He didn't say a word as he crossed the room, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. But his eyes devoured me, traveling from the hem of my gown to my eyes with a possessive heat that made my skin prickle with 1,000 tiny shocks of electricity. He wasn't carrying a ring box or a bouquet of flowers to seal our hastily arranged union. Instead, he held a small, lethal object in his hand, a ceramic dagger with a matte black handle that looked like it had been forged from the same darkness that lived in his soul. "I protect what is mine," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle my very bones as he knelt before me, not in supplication, but with the reverence of a knight swearing fealty to a dark queen. "But in this world, Ilara, being my wife puts a target on your back that is larger than the one you arrived with, and you need to know how to bite back when the wolves come sniffing." I held my breath as his warm hands slid up the slit of my dress, his touch searing against the cool skin of my thigh, and he strapped the leather sheath securely against my leg, the weight of the weapon hidden beneath the silk serving as a constant, chilling reminder that I was walking into a war zone, not a party. It was a distorted, twisted wedding gift, a promise of violence rather than a vow of love, yet as I looked down at his dark head bowed before me, I felt a surge of adrenaline that felt dangerously like power, realizing that he wasn't just hiding me behind him anymore. He was arming me to stand beside him. The drive to the underground gala was a blur of city lights streaking past the tinted windows like comets, a silent journey where Calum held my hand with a grip that was tight enough to bruise, tethering me to him as we descended into the belly of the beast. The venue was a cavernous, repurposed bank vault deep beneath the city streets, a space filled with crystal chandeliers that cast fractured rainbows over a crowd of people whose fortunes were built on bones, silence, and the kind of sins that would make the devil blush. As we stepped out of the car and approached the massive steel doors, The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume masking the metallic tang of fear, and I could feel the eyes of the city's underworld turning toward us, drawn by the gravitational pull of Calem's presence and the mystery of the woman on his arm. "Head up," he whispered against my ear, his breath hot and steady, his arm wrapping around my waist like a band of steel. "You are Mrs. Vesper now, and a Vesper does not cower before anyone, especially not the men who want to bury us." We descended the grand staircase, and the room fell into a hush that rippled outward from our entrance like a wave, the music seeming to dim as hundreds of predatory eyes locked onto us, assessing, judging, and calculating the threat we posed. I forced my spine to straighten, channeling every ounce of defiance I had left, letting the mask of the Don's wife slip over my fear, and I walked beside him with a chin held high, meeting the gazes of hitmen and thieves with a cold stare that challenged them to find the cracks in my armor. It wasn't long before the sea of tuxedos parted, and Victor Russo materialized from the crowd, like a shark surfacing in dark water. His face a roadmap of false joviality and barely concealed malice, flanked by the very men who had chased me down that hotel hallway. He smiled, a greased slide of teeth that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes, and stepped into our path with the arrogance of a man who thought he held all the cards, completely unaware that the deck had been reshuffled while he wasn't looking. "Kailum," Russo drawled, his voice oily and mocking, his gaze sliding over me with a lecherous familiarity that made my hand twitch toward the dagger on my thigh. "I see you've brought a guest tonight, though I don't recall seeing a +1 on your invitation, especially for strays." The insult hung in the air, sharp and poisonous, but Calem didn't flinch, didn't rage. Instead, he smiled, a terrifying, razor-thin expression that promised retribution, and pulled me flush against his side, his fingers digging into my hip in a display of ownership that was absolute. "You are mistaken, Victor," Calem said, his voice carrying through the silent room with the clarity of a bell tolling for a funeral. "This is not a guest, and certainly not a stray. Allow me to introduce my wife, Ilara Vesper." The shock that detonated in the room was palpable, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the space, and I watched the color drain from Russo's face as the implication of Calem's words hit him with the force of a physical blow. By marrying me, Calem had elevated me from a disposable witness to a protected matriarch of a rival family, meaning that any move Russo made against me now would violate the ancient truce and trigger a total war that would burn his empire to ash. I saw the calculation behind Russo's eyes, the realization that he had been outmaneuvered by a marriage of convenience, and for the first time since I stole that drive, I didn't feel like the hunted. I felt like the hunter. "A toast," Calem announced, grabbing 2 flutes of champagne from a passing waiter and thrusting one into my trembling hand, raising his glass to the stunned room. "To the future, and to the bonds that cannot be broken." The tension broke into a murmur of confused congratulations and wary applause, and the orchestra struck up a waltz, the haunting melody filling the vault as Calem took my glass, set it aside, and swept me onto the dance floor. We moved to the center of the room, spinning beneath the fracturing light of the chandeliers, and for a moment, the dangerous men and the lethal politics faded into the background, leaving only the heat of his body against mine and the intense magnetic pull of his gaze. "You did well," he murmured, his hand sliding up my back to rest against the bare skin between my shoulder blades, his touch branding me. "They are afraid of you, Ilara." "They are afraid of you," I corrected, looking up into his obsidian eyes, seeing the fire burning there, a mix of triumph and a darker, hungrier desire that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. "I'm just the symbol of your defiance." "You are more than that," he whispered, pulling me closer until there was no air left between us, his forehead resting against mine as we swayed to the music of our own destruction. You are the only person in this room who knows who I really am, and the only one brave enough to stand in the fire with me." As we danced, spinning through the intricate steps of a waltz that felt like a metaphor for our life together, a constant balance of power, trust, and danger, I felt the final resistance within me crumble, the hope of a normal life dissolving into the intoxicating reality of the present. I realized with a terrifying clarity that this wasn't just a fake marriage, a strategic alliance to survive the night. The way his hand molded to my waist, the way his eyes tracked every breath I took, and the way my own heart hammered a traitorous rhythm against his chest told me that the bond between us was forged in something far stronger than a signature on a certificate. I had run into the wrong hotel room to escape a death sentence, thinking I was fleeing the end of my life, desperately clawing for a few more minutes of freedom before the darkness overtook me. But as I looked into Calum Vesper's black eyes, feeling the cold steel of the dagger on my thigh and the warm steel of his arms around me, I realized that I hadn't escaped the darkness at all. I had embraced it. I had traded a quick death in a hallway for a long, beautiful, dangerous life sentence alongside the devil himself. And as he dipped me low, the world spinning around us in a blur of gold and shadow, I knew with a chilling certainty that I would never want to be free again. 6 months have passed since the night the music stopped, and the world watched me dance with the devil. And in that time, the lines between the woman I was and the woman I have become have blurred so completely that I no longer recognize the terrified girl who once scrubbed floors to make herself invisible. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, watching a torrential storm lash against the city below, the lightning illuminating the sprawling urban jungle that Calum now controlled with an iron fist, a kingdom of concrete and shadow that bowed to the name Vesper. The glass was cold against my forehead, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room behind me, where the fireplace crackled with the consumption of expensive timber. But I didn't move away from the chill, because I had learned that comfort was a luxury that made you soft. And in this life, softness was a fatal flaw. The war with the Russos hadn't ended with a handshake at the gala. It had merely shifted from the streets to the shadows, a cold war of attrition where lawyers wielded as much power as hitmen, and where my presence at Calum's side served as a constant, living checkmate that kept their violence at bay. I had become accustomed to the weight of the ceramic dagger strapped to my thigh, so much so that I felt naked without it, and the constant presence of the silent, hulking bodyguards who shadowed my every move had transformed from a source of anxiety into a reassuring reminder of my status. I was no longer a prisoner in the gilded cage. I was its keeper, a queen who had learned that if you want to survive living with a monster, you don't hide from him. You learn to breathe the same fire. I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening, followed by the familiar, purposeful stride of boots on marble, a sound that used to make my heart race with fear, but now triggered a rush of anticipation that coiled low in my stomach. Calum entered the room, bringing the scent of the storm with him, ozone, rain, and the metallic tang of the city. And as he stripped off his wet trench coat, tossing it carelessly onto a chair, I saw the weariness etched into the lines around his eyes, the toll of a man who held the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He didn't speak immediately. He simply walked toward me, his eyes locking onto mine with that intense gravitational pull that had never waned, and wrapped his arms around my waist, burying his face in the crook of my neck as he inhaled deeply, grounding himself in my presence. "They backed down," he murmured against my skin, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my chest, referring to the shipping lanes negotiation that had kept him away for 2 days. Russo realized he couldn't touch the ports without triggering the clauses in our marriage contract, and the old men on the commission sided with us. "I knew they would," I replied softly, turning in his arms to run my fingers through his damp, dark hair, feeling the tension slowly bleed out of his muscles under my touch. "You didn't marry a fool, Calum. You married the only leverage that matters." He pulled back to look at me, his obsidian eyes searching my face with a mixture of possessiveness and a dark reverence that still took my breath away. In the beginning, our union had been a shield, a wall built to keep the world out. But somewhere amidst the bloodshed and the late-night strategies, the wall had become a foundation for something real, something forged in the fires of survival. I reached into the pocket of my silk robe and pulled out the small, silver flash drive that had started it all, the piece of plastic that I had guarded like a dragon guarding gold, the secret I had withheld as my only insurance policy against his wrath. For months, it had been the elephant in the room, the silent question mark hanging over our heads, a reminder that trust was a currency we were still learning to exchange. Alpha Zulu Corcoran 9, I whispered, pressing the cold metal into his scarred palm, watching his eyes widen slightly in surprise. "You're giving it to me?" he asked, his voice guarded, his fingers closing slowly over the drive. "You know that without this, you have no leverage. If you give me the code, you are entirely at my mercy." "I'm not giving it to you because I'm afraid, and I'm not giving it to you because I need protection anymore," I said, stepping closer until our bodies were flush, my heart beating in a steady, powerful rhythm against his. "I'm giving it to you because I trust you to burn them all down, and I want to watch the fire from the front row." A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that promised ruin to his enemies and ecstasy to his wife. And he pocketed the drive before lifting me up, my legs instinctively wrapping around his waist as he carried me away from the window and the storm outside. "Then let it burn, my queen," he growled, claiming my mouth with a kiss that tasted of rain and forever. "We will build a new world from the ashes." I had rushed into the wrong room to escape danger, only to find that the danger was exactly where I belonged. I was no longer the girl running for her life. I was Ilara Vesper, the wife of the devil, and as the darkness of the bedroom swallowed us whole, I knew that I had finally, truly, come home.